The theme for today, or the topic, if you like, is honoring God in our everyday decisions. And the source of what I would want to talk about comes really from two scriptures, which look at two men who made a decision. And what I want to do is contrast the decisions that they made and see what that can teach us about how we honor God in the decisions we make, not just in the things we say, but the things we do and the decisions we make. Now, in the time that we've got this morning, I don't intend to read both passages. It would take up most of the time that I've been allotted. So what I'm going to do is my own mini paraphrase. I'll bring in one or two quotes of scriptures as we go on so that we ground them in the scripture. But if you've got a physical Bible with you, or if you've got something online, just stick your fingers in these two passages so that you can reference them as I'm going through what I'm talking about this morning. So the first passage is from 1 Samuel 13. So that's 1 Samuel 13. And in 1 Samuel 13, we see the account of Saul making a decision. Saul was the king, and he made a decision to offer a sacrifice instead of the prophet Samuel. So the context of this was that Jonathan, Saul's son, had attacked a Philistine outpost. And as a result of that, the Philistines were outraged. And so the Philistines came up against Israel with a mighty army. And it says that the men, Saul's soldiers, were scared. And so they hid in caves and they hid in cisterns because they saw the might of the Philistine army. But the prophet Samuel had told Saul to wait till he came to offer a sacrifice to bring God's blessing on the battle that was to ensue. But Samuel didn't turn up, and Saul decided that he couldn't wait anymore, so he offered the sacrifice himself. So that was the decision that I want to look at, that Saul decided that he would do what was the prophet's task. And when Samuel appears, he sees the burning sacrifice and admonishes Saul as a result. And Saul says, well, yeah, the men were fleeing and I wasn't going to have any army left. And the Philistines have got this great big horde of men. So I panicked and I did it myself. And that was a costly decision. One writer says that Saul effectively at that point sacrificed his kingdom in that one act. So that's the first decision I want to look at, Saul's decision that he was going to offer the sacrifice. The second passage and the second decision I want to look at comes a little bit later in Samuel. So if you can look at 1 Samuel 24. So in 1 Samuel 24, we see the account of David. And David was hiding in a cave with his men, and he gets the opportunity to kill Saul. And I want to look at David's decision and contrast David's decision there with Saul's decision. So in 1 Samuel 24, we see David hiding in a cave because he knows that Saul has brought his army to try and find him and kill him. And we're told that Saul is so focused on killing David that he brings 3,000 men to hunt him down. But Saul has a need to relieve himself, and he goes into the cave. And don't you just love the honesty of scripture? You know, here's the king. Even the king has to relieve himself, and he goes into the cave to do it. And he goes on his own, presumably because his men don't want to see the king relieving himself. So they thought he was safe. So he disappears into the cave. But they were wrong because they didn't know David and his men were hiding in the back of the cave. And David's men say to David, look, here's your chance. You know, God's put him in your hand. Let's, you know, this is your chance to deal with this. And David creeps forward as if he is going to kill Saul. But in that moment, it tells us that David reflects on what he's doing and has a change of heart. And instead of killing Saul, he just cuts off the corner of his robe. And when Saul leaves the cave, David feels guilty. He goes out, he prostrates himself before Saul, even though he knows that Saul is there to kill him, even though he knows Saul's got 3,000 men there to kill him, he bows down and he confesses what he's done. And David took that decision that he wasn't going to kill the king, but he was going to admit what he'd done, even if that meant risking his own life. So these two decisions, Saul offering the sacrifice, David not killing the king, but admitting what he had potentially been able to do. So how do we honor God in our day-to-day decisions? We're not making decisions as big and as significant as David and Saul. But every day we make decisions. Yeah, this morning you made decisions about what to wear, what to have for breakfast. Do you skip breakfast? What are you going to watch on TV? Lots of small decisions, but we make bigger decisions as well. So how do we treat that other person at work, at college, at school, at home? Do I spread that bit of gossip that someone's just told me? How do I respond when someone cuts me up in the car? What do I say when my boss tells me something that I'm not happy about doing, but he asks me to do it? We all make decisions at these points. And I want to explore how we bring honor and what influences how we bring honor from the decisions that Saul and David made. So I think there's 4 things that I want to bring out from this, and 4 things that I want to explore just briefly this morning. These are honoring authority, honoring God, the influence of other people, and our honor to ourselves and our self-image. So firstly, authority. In both situations, Saul and David had to make a decision about honoring authority. For Saul, the authority was in Samuel. Now you might say, well, Saul's the king. Surely he was the most important person. Surely he had all the authority as king. But in the relationship between the people and God, the prophet had authority in that relationship between people and God. And for Saul, the prophet was the person who had authority over his relationship between him and God. And Samuel had clearly told him that he was to be the one that was going to offer the sacrifice. Saul had no right to offer that sacrifice. So when Saul made that decision that he couldn't wait any longer, and he decided he would be the one that makes that sacrifice, he wasn't honoring Samuel's position. He wasn't honoring the person in authority. And regardless of what excuses he had, I was losing all my men, we were going to be defeated. The important thing was that to bring God's blessing on that battle, the prophet had to be the one that offered that sacrifice. And it didn't really matter how many men Saul lost. He could have lost all of his men. God still would have won that battle. But Saul's decision not to honor Samuel as the person in authority was part of the reason why he sacrificed his kingdom in that one decision. How do we contrast that with David? Well, if we think about the relationship of David and Saul, Saul was still king. Although David had been anointed, at that point in time, Saul was still the king. So David didn't have the authority to decide whether or not Saul should continue as king. That was God's decision. And so Saul still had dominion over Israel at that point, and he wanted David dead. We might not always agree with the decisions that authorities make, but they're in authority. And David recognized the fact that Saul was still his king. Put yourself in David's position for a minute. Here was someone who wanted you dead. He was hunting you down with 3,000 men, and he was all alone, and he was vulnerable, and he was relieving himself. You can't defend yourself easily when you're relieving yourself, can you? I've never been in that position, but just put yourself in that position. You can't fight back when you're in that position, can you? So was David's men right when they said to him in verse 4, "This is the day the Lord has spoke of, when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish"? What was David's decision? David's decision was he prostrated himself in front of the king. And he said to the king in verse 10, "Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed." He still recognized the authority, and he recognized the authority in that position. He made himself vulnerable, he prostrated himself, but he still recognized authority. It's interesting that and I'm sure you know this, but the only commandment that has a blessing is the fifth commandment that says in Exodus 25, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord is giving you. If we want to receive blessing, we have to honor those in authority. So what about the people in authority in our life? Yeah, we all have people who are given authority over us, whether that's at work, at home, in government. And here at City Church, we have our leadership team, our hub leaders. Do we honor them in all of our decisions? Last week, Craig introduced the City Church vision. What was your decision in response to that vision that Craig raised last week? When he went through that section on Isaiah 61, how did that make you feel? Are you prepared to honor the leadership and their decision that they've made in terms of setting that out as our vision? Are you going to make the decision to step behind Craig and the leadership team and go forward with that? Because if the commandment says if we honor those in authority, we will receive blessing, then if we honor Craig and the team in stepping behind that, then we will be blessed. So even when it's difficult, do our decisions honor those in authority over us, like David? Or do we step in and do it ourselves, like Saul did? Second thought is around God. Do we honor God in our decisions? I think the decisions of Saul and David, once again, had a reflection on how they honored God. We look at Saul, first of all, and the point of the sacrifice was that it would seek the approval of God in the upcoming battle. If you look at verse 12, it talks about God blessing them as a result of offering the sacrifice. But the law clearly says that the offering had to be made by the priest, and Samuel was the one who was doing that. So where was Saul's focus when he made that sacrifice? Well, he responded to Samuel when Samuel charged him by saying, well, his eyes were on the physical. He was focused on the fact that his men were panicking and running away, and he was afraid because of the size of the Philistine army. He had forgotten that God had blessed him with many miraculous victories. And in the history of Israel, there had been many miracles where God had stepped in, and it didn't matter the size of the army, whether it's 10 men, 10,000 men, God won the victory. And if Saul had had a big army and won the battle, then his army and his leadership would have been the ones who got the praise. But if God worked a miracle with a small number of men, God would get the praise. So Saul's eyes were on men and himself rather than looking to God. Contrast that with David. David, as we know, prostrated himself before Saul. He put his trust in God, not in himself. If he'd have put his trust in himself, he would have killed Saul in the cave. But he prostrated himself before God and put his trust in God and honored the call of God on his life when he went before the king. Just think about it. If you knew this king was going to kill you and he's there with 3,000 men, do you go out on your own and stand before the king and fall down before the king? It's not what we naturally do, is it? But David wasn't looking to himself in the situation. He was looking to God and honoring God in that situation. So it says in verse 15 of chapter 24, may the Lord be our judge. So he's putting his faith in God. May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. David was honoring God in his decision. He was putting his faith in God and secure in his position in God. Thirdly, what about others? How do others influence our decisions? In both of these accounts, both David and Saul, there was others that were having an impact on the honor that came out of that decision making. If we look at Saul, Saul had a fear of men because he was worried about his men leaving him. And so as a result of that, others were influencing him because he was more worried about men deserting him and leaving him on his own and making him look weak instead of trusting in God and the prophet. So the actions of those other people influenced or forced the way he acted. David was also pressured. David was directly pressured by his men. In verse 4, it says, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." So when his men said that to him, would David have thought of that before then? Would David have considered killing the king? Or was he influenced by his men whispering that in his ear, saying, "This is your chance, do it now"? But David had a few seconds between his men saying that and creeping up behind the king to kill him. And in that time, I wondered whether David was reflecting on whether he was doing the right thing. What's going through his mind? Was he praying to God? Was he saying, should I be doing this? Was he concentrating just on trying to be as quiet as possible so he didn't alert the king that he was there? Was he thinking about the best place to stab him? I don't know. But he had what I want to call a creeping time or crawling time between others saying something and him doing something. And in that time, he reflected on making the right decision. He didn't just respond to other people. As a result of that, he made the right decision. So who do we listen to? Who influences our decisions? And do we give ourselves those few seconds of calling time just to reflect on what God is saying and to reflect on, well, who is bringing honor? If I make this decision, do I bring honor to God? Do I bring honor to authority? How do we give ourselves that time to reflect? And finally, self. We honor ourselves and we honor the image of God in ourselves by the decisions that we make. So how was the image of self in both David and Saul when they made these decisions? I think we have to remember that both David and Saul were king. So their image of self was that they had been anointed to be king. Saul was in that role. David was promised that role. He was just waiting for it. What was their image? Well, these were two men who'd been selected by God. They knew they'd been selected by God for a particular purpose. Did that self-image receive honor in the choices that they made? Well, Saul didn't act like someone who'd been appointed to lead, did he? He was panicking. He was seeing his men fleeing. He wasn't taking charge as king. He was worried about his identity as king being lost if he lost the battle. So instead of drawing strength from God and his image, he took on the wrong identity. He took on the self-identity that wasn't the one God had given him, because he took on the one of the prophet and offered the sacrifice. If we contrast that to David, David had the opportunity to make the wrong decision. He could have taken things into his own hands, created his own image by killing the king, but he trusted his image in God. He trusted the fact that God would be the one who would deliver him. And because of that, I believe that David was honored, because he honored his image in God. What about us? What's our self-image? Well, we're told in 1 Peter 2, verse 9, it says this: "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his possession." Dwell on that for a minute. That is our identity. We are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. That's the image you and I carry whenever we make decisions. And it goes on to say in verse 9, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Doesn't that reflect bringing honor? That we may proclaim the excellencies of him when we're living as a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his possession. Doesn't that bring honor? So that's our identity. So when we're making decisions, are we living within that identity that God has given us? That we are holy, that we are a royal priesthood, that we are chosen. Think about it for a minute. If you've been chosen, how does that govern the way that you act and the decisions you make? knowing that you are chosen, knowing that you're in that privileged position, that we make different decisions as a result of that than the ones we might have made if we weren't picked. The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, has chosen us to live in darkness, to live in light, not in darkness. And we should show that in the decisions that we make. So we've seen two different situations. We've seen David and Saul, and we've seen how they've made different decisions which affected how they brought honor to authority, the people in authority over them, how they honored God in what they were doing and their position in God, recognizing how other people were influencing their decision, and at the end of the day, honoring their identity, their position, where God had put them. So I've created a document which has got some reflective questions just to make you think a bit more about some of the topics and ideas that I've brought up today. I think Craig's distributed that to the hub leaders. So the hub leaders might want to have a time together where together you explore some of the issues, or you might want to use that on your own just to explore and think about some of the ideas that I've talked about this morning. But hopefully that's provoked you into some thinking about how we make decisions and how those decisions bring honor to authority, to God, and to our self-image. And I'll hand back to Craig.